Okay, it's 3 o'clock, so let's start the seminar. Welcome everybody to this webinar on Asia-Europe digital connectivity. Now, looking at the weather conditions outside, I think many of us are quite happy that we have digital connectivity and that this event is a webinar and not a physical event. My name is Bart Gans and I am leading researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. This webinar is actually part of a project that we have been running at FIA on connectivity. And the project aims to explore connectivity, both theoretically and conceptually. And it also looks into the different connectivity strategies of major global players like China, like the US, the EU, and Japan. And this webinar is the first in what is hopefully going to be a series of events. And they will give us the opportunity to look more into issues relating to connectivity that we have not been focusing on so much in the project. And one of those issues that we have not been focusing so much on is indeed digital connectivity. So I'm very happy indeed today to have with us somebody who can enlighten us a bit more on some aspects relating to digital connectivity, and in particular, the role it plays in the EU's global gateway strategy. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to Maaike Heijmans. Maaike is a senior research fellow at the Klingendaal Institute in The Hague, Netherlands. And there she leads the program on the geopolitics of technology and digitalization. Now, following Maaike's talk, there will be comments provided by Christian Fjeder. He is a former FIA visiting research fellow and currently CEO of the Geostrategic Intelligence Group. So also welcome to you, Christian. The audience can read more on the background of both speakers, their expertise, publications, and so on. You can find all that in the program that has been sent to you. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Maaike. She will give us a presentation of, let's say, 20 to 25 minutes. And that will be followed by comments by Christian. And the remaining time will be reserved for Q&A. Finally, to the audience, I would like to still say that you can put your questions already in the chat function during the presentation, so you don't have to wait until the presentations are finished. Please, by all means, ask your questions in the chat function as soon as the question pops up in your head. So I will now happily give the floor to Maaike, please.
Thanks so much, Bart. It's great to be with you online in this digital connected meeting, and I'm very glad that you also invited a discussant so that hopefully we can have a good kickstart to the discussion. And congratulations on this new series, of course. I hope there will be, well, this will be the first of many interesting ones that people can share their thoughts about connectivity, because I do think this is important. It has been on my research agenda for a few years now already. And, you know, it comes with ups and downs and different names. So I'll like to elaborate a little bit on that first. You know, what is connectivity? Why is it important? Why is it still considered by some to be sort of a fluffy topic? And what should we be doing, acting on this? And in doing so, what are the key challenges? And then, of course, this focus on digital. I think this focus on digital was clearly not in the EU's mind when we first started many years ago working in this field. But this has really come with the change of times, you know, the geopolitical fracturing, we can say, and the role that technology and digitalization plays in that has also made for the fact that digital connectivity is more important today. So first, let me tackle a question that or a point that I often hear, which is that connectivity and global gateway, you know, the label under which it was sort of, well, extended last December, that global gateway is nothing new. I hear that a lot. And I always my answer to that question is that indeed it's nothing new in the sense that, the EU has been trading, has been investing, has been doing, development projects throughout the world for many years already. So that's nothing new. That's also what connectivity is trying to do. But there is, I think, a fundamental difference between that old and the new, that connectivity as a label and Global Gateway as a label are sort of trying to convey, which is that we have to do this now with a new mindset and with new approaches. And that this is important because in a world where we have more geopolitical contest, we have a rise for new geopolitical leadership, for technological leadership, and that one big challenger is certainly not likely to follow, the Western ways of doing. If there is, something as Western ways, because actually one of the challenges that we're facing also here in the field of digital connectivity is that the US and the EU are also not always aligned. But they are, of course, more aligned than what we are to some other countries. So that sort of strategic mindset, that strategic environment really should shape our way of doing trade and our way of doing investment and development projects, both in the sense of where we are going. So perhaps not just no longer focus on the countries that we traditionally were in and very dispersed, different EU member states doing a lot of projects in many African countries, but therefore not getting to the scale that is really needed to make a bigger impact. So we need to get to different regions, perhaps, where there's also concerns, not just about, whether a country can develop on its own, but also the possible, impact that a third country's presence can have. And we've seen this, of course, with the debates about China's debt trap policy, which, I think is far more complicated than this simple line suggests. But it goes to show that the presence of China, obviously, the elephant in the room, let's just mention it, is making for a clear difference here. So there is something, I think, new about connectivity and about Global Gateway. So when did this all start? Well, that was several years ago already. You could take it as far back as 2013 or 14, when the EU, embarked on what I call Connectivity 1.0, which was then still under the, labeled economic diplomacy. And it was, about more than trade and investment promotion, as some countries, typify. Economic diplomacy was also about trying to build, connections between trade and investment and development, and doing so already with a more, strategic sense of purpose. That evolved in 2018, 2019 in the EU into connectivity. And that was the EU-Asia Connectivity Partnership. So here we have this focus on Asia and Europe in the Indo-Pacific, as we call it now. But this was really, obviously because China had launched by then its own the Belt and Road Initiative. At least that's the, Connectivity China 3.0. Because they had different labels also. So we went from economic diplomacy to connectivity, and today the label is a Global Gateway. But, what I'd like to emphasize is broader context to also see that, before China launched that Belt and Road Initiative, the EU was already active in this field, starting to understand that, we need a more geopolitical approach and mindset to our action in the world. And that has only obviously become more urgent in recent years. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. So there was 2 not so successful attempts, if you will, at least not so successful in the sense that, there was a broadly shared understanding of what this agenda is trying to achieve, and how to implement it. And I think that's basically because, too many member states were not really on board. EU institutions were not really coordinating between themselves. And then, came Global Gateway in December last year, when Ursula von der Leyen basically just, slapped her hand on the table and said, now we're really going to do this all together. We're going to lead this from the top, and I'm asking you all to contribute to this. And that's obviously a very powerful statement, for a top leadership to make. So the commitment is really there, the political commitment. That's a huge difference now between connectivity 1.0 and 2.0, if you will. But still, people are getting sort of, okay, where's the real action, right? And we see this also in the field of digital connectivity, as I will get to in a second. So what's the core objective of Global Gateway overall? It's to ensure, I think, and that's a really important point, not just development elsewhere, but also our own competitiveness. Make sure that, we have players in different, key technological and digital fields. And that we have connections also for secure supply chains. The COVID pandemic obviously showed that we need that we rely on China and India for, medical and pharmaceutical products, and obviously chips. Coming from the Netherlands, I have to mention chips, of course. So there were all these connections that were disrupted. So this was a new phase also in connectivity, not just in the process, but in the mindset. That's, connectivity cannot be, the more the merrier, because there's obviously also downsides to being all too connected to certain countries, or all too, mindedly be connected. So the idea then, I think started to develop that we need more trusted connectivity. I'll elaborate on what that is, in just a second. But also next to trusted connectivity, also diversity. So not just connectivity with one country for a certain product, especially if it's a critical product, that's of course problematic, but try to diversify also between those. So connectivity in that sense also came to be regarded in different ways. And I think, we see this especially in the tech and digital field where, there was really a lot of rivalry starting here. So obviously much is at stake here, and China certainly plays a big role in it. But what I think we have to do is to stick to a very positive narrative, that highlights what the EU is offering to third countries as an alternative opportunity. So, and it's of course an alternative opportunity to grow in Chinese presence, specifically in the tech and digital field, where we know that Huawei, has been really pushed by the Chinese government to go out and build a telecommunications network, so that Chinese companies also in the tech and digital field can benefit from that and building on that, on those networks, which are of course more compatible with Chinese companies than they are with our own. So there's a reason, also for that, in that context, to be looking at this field in particular. So personally, I think it was a very good step that, Global Gateway, it sends a clearer message to the world that the EU wants now to take more action. It's committed to investing also more, right? There was this number of 300 billion mentioned, and, some of that is old money, you could say, definitely. So I think the difference is more in the way that this money is hopefully going to be generated, which is through public-private partnerships. And that is something that is a way that we can get to the scale that is really needed. Because as I said, especially tech and digital projects, if you're going to build a submarine cable or a space station, satellites, you need scale funding, and you need also to have companies who can deliver on this. So the EU is saying, committing with Global Gateway to investing in this and to reaching out to other countries with this, what we call an inclusive approach and principled approach. So we're acknowledging the geopolitical competition, as, by the way, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU and of various EU member states does. It's also acknowledging the importance of and the practical opportunities for development that are offered by other countries, and then, obviously no naivete about, what standards come with that, and saying, what we on Europe have on offer with a view to this. So I think that's the bigger context that we have to really be aware of if we're looking at this in this field. So what are some of the challenges that I see here, and some of the discomforts, perhaps? I think, first of all, it's important to highlight that, yes, we do see political momentum, especially in Brussels. I haven't seen my own Prime Minister Rutte, for example, highlight, that this is an important activity. We have a lot of talk about China here in the Netherlands these days, but not so much about what I think is indirect China policy. And that's, how you could interpret also connectivity. And I think the Netherlands is no exception here. We have few leaders that are committed to really making this work. The Germans, I think, have been sort of leading the way in this field, but well, they haven't always been successful to bring about, for example, a commissioner, an EU commissioner for connectivity, as they had wanted earlier. So European actors also within Brussels remain divided. The situation we are in now is that the DG for International Partnerships, they are in charge of a global gateway. And we know them, of course, because of their development assistance background. And this is also the problem, because sometimes it seems that they're sort of still stuck in that development narrative, whereas investment is really more crucial to connectivity, and especially digital connectivity, again, because of the scale. So External Action Service, many of you perhaps thought that, hey, weren't they in charge? Yes, they were in charge, but no longer so, since they don't have the money and they don't have the sectoral expertise and the constituency, right? So it was sort of difficult for them to really lead the way, although in view of the connections and the geopolitical considerations, obviously the External Action Service is the one that knows their stuff. And then we have EU member states. They should also really, play a big role in much of the action here, because also they have the money and the companies. We don't have EU companies. We have still EU member state companies. But many of the member states don't have the strategic imperative. So that's the challenge, right? We are sort of still divided here. Another challenge is that we need multi-stakeholder cooperation, right? The innovations today, in the tech and the digital field, they come from within companies, not from within the government, and then transferred to companies or to society, through the business sector. But it starts from the business sector. So the governments, if they don't want to always be behind with, for example, regulation, they have to make sure that they build closer ties to the private sector to know what is there, and also to sensitize them to concerns that we may have if they want to take certain products to certain countries. And some companies might still, take certain products to certain countries if they are asked not to do so, but others, due diligence has kicked in and they will not be doing that, but they have to know. So I think we need to build those, what sometimes is called multi-stakeholderism, that also includes the consumer, the people basically, who also need a seat at the table to bring in their own views, because obviously we are now also in this digital domain, but we've had very little say in how it's being built, right? And the freedoms and the rights and, how you can express those. Knowing that and having a say at that table is, I think, important, especially in the digital field, because so much is still, we are just about to understand. A third challenge that I see for the EU, and this is also especially comparing to Asian countries or Indo-Pacific countries, is that our mindset is still rather top-down and sort of legalized, right? It's not really flexible or networked cooperation. So we're only now trying to, figure out, okay, perhaps, if there's supply chain issues, especially in the semicon sector, maybe we should also be part of what they call in the Indo-Pacific, the CHIPS 4 cooperation between a group of countries that are really leaders on this. Shouldn't we connect to that? And similarly, there are other sort of more flexible networks when we might have to engage with. And, we're just learning to do that. But overall, it's still rather top-down. And then the fourth problem that I could highlight is that differences, as I already said, actually, they exist not just with, that one country that is so rapidly developing and so different from us in terms of values and principles, at least. But we have differences also with the United States, right? In the United States, it's basically companies that have been given a lot of freedom to develop. And too much freedom, frankly speaking, we think here in Europe, right? So this is why the EU is now through the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and earlier through data protection regulation, trying to put people back, in the driving seat and, their interests first. But, obviously we have differences here with the United States. Also, it's not just with China. So here. So that's a challenge, right? If we also want to cooperate, we really need the United States because we are so much closer together compared to others. So I'll, happy to elaborate on this later, but I think delving a little bit deeper specifically in the field of digital connectivity, Digital became, as I said, more higher on the agenda with connectivity 3.0. So global gateway, that really explicates, it mentions digital first, whereas connectivity 1.0 and 2.0 was largely about transport, right? We heard a lot about ports and roads and railways, including here in Europe. We still know that famous project of Budapest-Belgrade Railway. That was the focus early on, and now, over time, also thanks to our American friends who have been knocking on our door about, for example, 5G and Huawei, now the digital is really on our minds. And here I think we really need to, there's sort of 3 building blocks or 3 key points if we look at digital connectivity. And I'm drawing here also from a conference that we organized at Klingendael for the EU, or with the EU, on digital connectivity in between Europe and Asia. It's still online. It's called ISCON. If you would like to look back, the Asia-Europe Sustainable Connectivity Conference was held in March 2023. Excuse the self-propaganda for a minute. But from here, I took 3 key points that I think is, or building blocks, as I said, for digital connectivity. And one is infrastructure, one is security, and one is international cooperation. There was a Singaporeese presenter who was very clear on this and very convincing. So I'll draw from his points and include a few of my own here as well. So infrastructure, right? We sometimes forget in Europe, where we are so relatively well connected through digital infrastructure, that other parts of the world are not. And that they are still wanting to also have that very basic for digital connections. So the investments in digital infrastructure are still very important in all regions throughout the world, and especially in the less developed regions. And they all, all those countries and all those regions also want to benefit from this digital age and from the data-driven age. So they need infrastructure for that. Physical infrastructure, first of all. So that's telecommunications network and fiber optic cables, the 5G, and already soon coming 6G. Then we have submarine cables and satellites, and all have their pros and cons, obviously, as we could have seen in the past few months. So that's important. And then there's also soft infrastructure, as it's called, which is more the regulatory side, right? How do you organize all of this? And we need investments in that. Sometimes we forget, and sometimes we forget also the scale again that is needed for this. I keep repeating this point. So I think this is really, one thing that hopefully people will take away from this webinar, that, the importance of physical infrastructure in digital connectivity. Then the second point is security. It's really an age where we are looking at secure and resilient digital infrastructure. Not just digital infrastructure, that all can benefit from. We know by now that there's, what goes online has, it can be compromised and it can be influenced. Disinformation, misinformation have become big problems. So there's a big impact also on societies. We want to prevent that, right? And there's also, an impact on physical infrastructure, of course. They also need to be protected and secured. Including our energy infrastructure, which also relies on digital tools increasingly. So there's a lot of, it's a lot of value to getting to trusted connections. It's no longer just about connectivity, but we hear increasingly more about trusted connectivity. And I think, our Estonian friends here in Europe are leading the way. And I think they deserve a lot of praise for that, and a lot more attention than what, they're sometimes getting. So it's no longer, connectivity is no longer just complementary, but it can also be competitive. And the various stakeholders do hold competitive views. As I said, I think that, we see, especially in digital connectivity, that, many of the values that we thought were so self-evident, they're actually under stress. They're under stress from autocratic regimes, but also sometimes democratic regimes. So how do we deal with that? It's a huge question that we have to tackle. And then the third building block, I think, for digital connectivity is international cooperation, right? How do we ensure that all our different infrastructures are actually talking to each other and connected to each other, are interoperable, as we say. And that has to be, interoperability at the country-to-country level, people-to-people level. And the EU is investing a lot in this, so we can discuss that a little bit more in detail later. But clearly there are platforms needed for this discussion and dialogue between governments, private sector, and the people. That's important. So as I said, trusted connectivity is, I think, a key term for everybody to remember. Trust is a central element in the digitalization process, because people, they will only use the system if they trust it, right? Otherwise, they won't trust it and they won't benefit from it, and they lose chances for development. So the people want to know that, they are not under the control. The things that they don't control, I should say, the users want to know that the things that they don't control because they just use them are trusted. So they need to know that they can trust the providers and the governments that regulate, and sometimes can also be providers for digital identities, for example. Because we know by now that technology is not neutral, right? That was perhaps 20 years ago we still heard people say that, but I think it's important to keep emphasizing technology is not neutral. It's impacted by the environment in which it was created, so it matters who builds the infrastructure. So what is happening in EU action in digital connectivity, specifically in the Indo-Pacific? We see a lot of action with digital partnership agreements, which are now a new tool to build trust and to get to trusted connectivity. And it's for technical and for policy and for research collaboration. It's a big scheme of things. With Japan, earlier this year was the first DPA, as they call it, Digital Partnership Agreement, was signed. We have talks ongoing with Singapore and with South Korea. So there's, several of the key countries in the region. And then we also have, of course, a Trade and Technology Council between the EU and India, which is, doing a slightly different approach, obviously. But, it's both about technology, cooperation and coordination. So I think, we can look at them also sort of in tandem, because both the TTC and the DPAs, they try to communicate positive and market-based offers with a human-centered approach that the EU is propagating always, right? Also, we see much development in the field of digital for development. And this is also coming from Brussels to a large extent. There's a digital for development hub, and one is being created, or maybe by now just created, for Asia specifically also. And here is where the EU and the member states are trying to work together to help other countries in their digitalization processes. Because as I said, many countries are still lagging in this field, and they want to also reap the opportunities. And the shift, of course, now the challenge is to do so not longer so much with the development, but with an investment narrative, because then we can get to the scale. There's also the Digital Public Goods Alliance and the GovTech initiative, and then of course a lot of things happening in the that try to foster the green and digital transitions. I won't have time to delve into that right now, but just important things happening here. And I do want to mention also the first success of digital diplomacy of the EU that was not specifically focused on the Indo-Pacific, but Indo-Pacific countries also on board. This was the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. How do we organize and structure the internet, and how do we make sure, for example, that the governments don't get too much of a say in regulating online content, for example. That was an important development also. What I think is the next step, and I'll end with that, is the EU should really think also about digital chapters, digital trade and commerce sectors, chapters in their free trade agreements. We are now doing that with Japan. We have a free trade agreement, or actually an economic partnership agreement, for example, with Japan, but there's no digital trade chapter in there. So we're working on this. Singapore has developed in Asia as a hub for such digital economy agreements. And we are still sort of looking how to engage with that. But I think if the aim is for trusted interoperability, and you can think of, how do you do invoicing and in digital identities? So online digital payments or invoicing, using digital identities, that requires trust. and that has to be built, and that can be sort of regulations in those trade chapters, digital trade chapters, that can also help foster that. So there's still a lot of work to do, a lot of things happening, and yeah, look forward to the discussion and your views on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maaike, for this excellent and very insightful and comprehensive overview of what has been going on in the sphere of digital connectivity, including the shift from connectivity 1.0 to 3.0, let's say, with a much more heavy focus on the digital indeed, and on regulations and on the soft side of connectivity, so to say. What I also found what was interesting was or what was new is this acknowledgement of the geopolitical competition, indirect competition with China, and so on behalf of the EU. So maybe if I can just add a very short follow-up question to that, because just a couple of days ago there was a rather big conference in Central Asia. Actually, it was held in Samarkand in Kazakhstan, the Central Asia Connectivity Conference, and there were some initiatives launched there in the sphere of digital connectivity and satellite communication in particular. Now, the media was very quick to jump on that and say, okay, the EU is finally acknowledging this competition with China as well as with Russia. They're trying to counterbalance these two countries. The EU is becoming more pragmatic and is, rather than emphasizing democratization in these countries, it is now focusing more on building up state resilience. Do you think that is true? Is that actually happening? This new movement, let's say, and would you agree that for the EU, Central Asia, Eastern neighborhood, and so on, is a priority?
Yeah, great questions, and I'm not a Central Asia expert, so I'll try to answer with my knowledge. But definitely, Central Asian countries have also become more of a priority to the EU overall in recent years. We know that the former connectivity ambassador, Romana Vlahutin, she traveled extensively to the region, right, for that exact reason, because we will be needing more diverse connections also towards Asia, and also actually now, rather than just through the Central Asian countries, also the southern corridor through Turkey, because of geopolitical reasons, is becoming more important. But you're asking about Central Asia connectivity, and is the EU becoming more pragmatic? Yes, and in my view, rightly so. Are we, giving up on our principles and our standards? I don't think so. We're just trying to implement them in a different way, in a more pragmatic way, that perhaps from bottom up can build, over a longer period of time where we want to get to. And here again, digital transition plays a big role, right? The regulation that governments adopt for, on how do people behave on the internet? What are you required to share in terms of data to, a company or to the government? That's important, and that helps shapes your democracy also. And I think engaging in discussions of that kind with countries that are going through that transition is a really important way of also having the discussion about democracy. But it's a new way. It's not like, we here in the Netherlands used to have parliamentarians here in The Hague talking about democracy and human rights violations in other countries, and hoping that would make a difference. But we've come to see, I think, that the sort of finger pointing does not really work. So we're being more pragmatic about it, or actually rather than pragmatic, because that's sort of it's almost a negative term. I would say, building from bottom up for human rights.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. You said another thing that was new is the focus on trusted connectivity and the link with security. So on that note, I suggest we now move over to Christian, who will give us a couple of insights in that sphere. Christian, please.
Hi, thanks Bart, and thanks Maaike for that interesting conversation there as well. I'm not going to go very deep into my background, but I think it's just fair to warn here that I've worked over 20 years in security risk and resilience, first in private sector, in the telecommunications sector, then in government and in research. So in my research, I've also focused on issues such as geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. So I guess it's time to say hello, meet the pessimist. Having said that, I do agree with Maaike that we certainly need to retain a certain level of optimism, because especially all kinds of connectivity, but especially digital connectivity just plays such a critical role in our economies and even in our sort of daily lives that we certainly need digital connectivity. We probably do need more of it. But as Mike alluded already as well, the context is also changing. And I think with this changing context, we probably have a need to rethink a little bit about how we could establish that sort of trusted or trust-based connectivity that Mike mentioned, and especially from the point of view of security and risk. So far, and speaking of optimism, I think that has been the sort of dominant feature in this conversation for the past couple of decades since the Cold War ended. And to a point, I think it has been a bit of a risk. So the whole time we kind of assumed that more connectivity is better. So as Mike said, the more the merrier. So that interconnectivity, so increasing interconnectivity was expected to produce interdependence, and interdependence on its own, on the other hand, was expected to sort of bring more stability and peace. So the basic idea was that countries would actually lose more from cutting interdependence than what they would gain. So for fear of sort of losing out, they would actually play along the rules and behave responsibly, if you can kind of use that term. And hence we've been sort of focusing on just establishing more connectivity and more free and freer flows of information. And with an idea even that, and it's being quite Western driven if we are honest. So we kind of assumed also that it will foster democracy, spread liberal democratic word order or system, and in all sort of produce a lot of good things. And I think to a great extent that has been the case. But somehow in that conversation, I think we did lose sort of sight of especially strategic aspects of risk, and maybe focused mostly really on sort of technical aspects of risk by claiming that connections themselves are not the risk. And I think to a great extent that is true. The risk really, or the threats really depend on the actions and intentions of the participants in the network. So if they behave responsibly and constructively, the risks are not very great. But I think if we're going to ignore the extent that this context is changing now, we do it probably to our peril in lots of ways. But I don't want to go to or resort to scaremongering, and this is not black or white. I think just we need more balanced conversation in terms of the fact that connections still, from national security point of view, especially in this type of contested system that we operate right now, are going to be seen as vulnerabilities. Because whether the actors in the network have the intention or the capabilities or means to inflict harm, connections do sort of enable that, if they just do have that intention and that capability to do so. So the threats are really actually very context specific, and now that we at least increasingly moving, and again I don't want to exaggerate too much, but we clearly sort of moving to this more contested system where geopolitical conflict and geoeconomic competition shapes the thinking of states more and more. So instead of sort of just seeing connectivity as purely sort of source of interdependence and independence as a good thing, we also start seeing them as vulnerability. And vulnerabilities that can be exploited by hostile actors are potential risks. So I'm not saying they all will be. The risk may vary quite a lot from context to context, but in the context of conflict, these risks may be considerable. And to a lot of extent, I think we already made this mistake in the context of energy interdependence, as we've seen unfortunately recently. We kind of refuse to have a balanced conversation about what dependence, and I'm personally using the word dependence because that is now the sort of the term that we use instead of interdependence. What the impact of dependence on Russia in energy services, energy resources was. And it would be quite tragic if we would kind of repeat this also in the digital side. Our societies are becoming more and more digital. It's not just the basic services in terms of our working lives that we depend on digital services and different digital infrastructures, but our societies, the critical services in our societies, the critical societal functions depend increasingly also on digital connectivity or digital services. So if we don't sort of really find a way to think about this in a more balanced manner, I'm afraid we probably might run a risk of sort of repeating the error we did before, going from sort of this very optimistic view to the other extreme, sort of black and white type of sort of word we use, where first there are no considerable risks whatsoever identified or sort of acknowledged, to a thinking where everything's a risk, and neither is true. So obviously the sort of reality is somewhere between those two things. And in order to do that, I think really we need to start thinking about how can we sort of address the aspects of security and risk. How can we build that trust so that we can establish and operate connections without at the same time exposing ourselves to critical national security risk. So instead of sort of going into paranoia, start having really adult conversations in terms of what the risk could be. But this really, I think, kind of really requires sort of giving up some of the old type of ways of thinking and having conversations about risk. Previously, we kind of really focused or recently we focused on sort of risk management that has been really sort of copied from the private sector and from the finance sector in particular, where we've had these difficult conversations between, for instance, the operators, private operators of critical infrastructures and national security officials about the probability of risks in these type of things. So in national security context, we can't be focusing on frequency based sort of risk. Just because something hasn't materialized before, risk hasn't materialized before, it doesn't mean it won't happen again. And since if we are talking about risks that actually somehow are seen as endangering the citizens' lives and well-being, or the strategic interest of the state, those risks are in general actually considered as unacceptable. So this sort of frequency-based risk approach is really not going to be working. But the old type of sort of national security risk, where we looked at risk being national security, meaning threats combined with vulnerability, probably doesn't work either. Again, sort of just focusing on the threats probably drives us to a direction where we probably will be making very unbalanced decisions in terms of the benefits and the risks of, for instance, connections or the services operated through them. So what could this sort of conversation look like? I think in lots of ways it's inter-regional or interregional connectivity is a good example of things. I think it just basically needs a very sort of open discussion. So we should really openly acknowledge that there are risks involved. We should talk about them in a more sort of realistic manner. And it should be okay to actually point out to the worst case scenarios, not because the intention is to scare people, but to actually make everybody involved aware that there are potentially significant risks involved, and we have to somehow mitigate and get over them in order to actually get where we want to go. So all these sort of conversations that are happening currently, for instance, in the context of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific region and so forth, they can be good. The risk, of course, is that we're going to go more into blockification in these conversations. And as Mike said, there are differences not just between, for instance, Europe and Asia in terms of how we view, for instance, risk and trust, but also between the United States and Europe. So I think, this I'm going to leave it to here. I'm not going to go into more detail, but before we jump into conclusions in terms of, I noticed there was in questions about reshoring, nearshoring, and ally actually reshoring, nearshoring, and I would add ally shoring. There are different ways of diversification as well that we can use in these conversations, but we need to have this sort of, we need to acknowledge also the risk before we can in any effective manner start mitigating them and build that trust. So I've ended here at this point in time, but happy to comment more and a little bit more in detail in terms of what I mean, some of these rather technical terms. So sorry for that.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this more, let's say, pessimistic or maybe realistic look on things. And also, I thought it was quite important to point out the need for a balanced and open conversation on these dependencies and risks. Mike, would you like to respond briefly to these comments before we move on to the more general Q&A?
Sure. Yes, great points indeed. And I think if I sounded overly positive, that would be new also, because I do see many of the risks. But what I do see happening now in Europe is perhaps an overly focus on what I call the protect agenda. So there had been we had been overly connected on just openness and connections as a being good in principle, and now we're sort of reconsidering that okay, maybe they're not always the openness is not always good, so we have to make that conditional. And I think that's actually finally I was this is happening. I'm glad it is happening, because this full-fledged openness was unsustainable, I think. So it's good that we're reflecting on the conditions, and we're the EU is investing in a lot of trade defense instruments, investment screening, export control, and several other the economic coercion instruments. I think they are all can be considered as measures to deal with, okay, we want to keep connections open, we want to still invest in connectivity, but it cannot be, just openness 100%. So that's good. What I'm more worried in actually is that we are, not acting fast enough on the promote side. So where investments have to be made for EU's own interest, also in third countries, that is going relatively slow. And I understand why, because that's a very cumbersome process. It's a very long process. The threats are much less, apparent, not so much in our face as when we see Chinese investments, for example, here in Europe. We realize that they are for strategic purposes in critical sectors, and we limit that. That's a clear and present danger sort of that we are acting on. If we are thinking of the need to invest in other countries where democracies, neighboring countries or countries surrounding Europe, where democracies are under pressure, that, as a trigger effect over time and in different fields, may lead to migration, may lead to also impact us here in Europe, or may lead to fewer, less economic development, and hence fewer market opportunities for our own companies to also benefit from. That's less apparent, of a threat or an opportunity. And I think that probably explains why we are not investing so much, or why member states are not yet, on paper they are all aligned, but in practice they are, taking quite a while to really act on this. And as I said, this is, to my mind, still going too slow, whereas the developments on the protect side are going relatively fast. And in between, by the way, is the regulate or shape agenda, as I like to call it. That's sort of, the DPAs, the digital partnership agreements, are one way of, one example of that, by which we try to shape with other countries, that relationship and our own societies, but also perhaps third country societies. That is happening. But that's also because the EU, has the competence to act in some of these fields. Whereas it does not have so much, development assistance or investment tools to actually act on the promote side.
Thank you. Christian, I see you partly shaking your head, but perhaps we can.
Yeah, I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Would you like to have a brief intervention, please?
Yeah, no, I was actually reading the comments in the meeting chat, and I'm not shaking my head in a sort of signaling that I would disagree. I'm just sort of shaking my head in terms of sort of desperation, how difficult these conversations will become, because there is a point in the comments that specifically kind of relates to the submarine cables, but actually that same sort of challenge that is highlighted there applies to everything else that is considered of strategic interest or interest in national security, and that is how we can sort of have these sort of private sector actors actually mostly building and operating these infrastructures that are increasingly seen as national security and strategic interest of states. And I don't have any short answer to that, except that, again, I think in that area also we need a whole new conversation. What basically we did after the Cold War was we draw a conclusion that critical infrastructures and services work better and more cost-effectively if they actually operated by private entities, and that's why a lot of countries privatize these functions. And I think that was probably the right thing to do in the context of that time. The problem is that we then did not have any really serious conversation in terms of who takes accountability for actually securing these type of infrastructures against state actors. So in situations where we have geopolitical conflict and undersea infrastructures are actually being blown up, is it the responsibility of the private operators, or is it the responsibility of the state? How is that accountability divided between the two? And this is quite difficult, but I think this is a good probably point to point out that the European Union actually is addressing this issue as well, not only in the digital side, where you have the Network and Infrastructure Security 2 directive, but also in the side of sort of the other critical services and infrastructures by proposing this new directive on critical entities resilience. So it is sort of, that conversation is starting. It's just that we haven't gotten very far in terms of it, and we are probably in a little bit more hurry to have a serious conversation about how that accountability is going to be best distributed between states and the private sector.
Thank you. You already kind of partly answered the third question in the list, but maybe we can have a look at the total of the three questions, and then I will give you each still some time to answer, perhaps starting with Christian and then finishing with Maike. So the first question is, when the EU is approaching Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and others, what makes the EU offers interesting to these Asian partners? The second question that Christian also already partly answered, the role of reshoring and friend-shoring in this context. And then finally, the question about the fiber optical cables and so on. How can the public sector or governments participate in the development of submarine fiber optic connectivity and infrastructure between European and Asian partners?
I would almost push actually this first question towards Maike rather, but Is it okay if I try to sort of tackle the other two already?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, going back to this sort of changing context, I really see that unfortunately in the sort of era of geoeconomic competition, we are really starting to see increasingly states being more willing and active in using economics and technology as tools for advancing their strategic interests. The problem with this is it also creates the need for other countries to protect themselves against such uses, malign uses of economic relations and technology. So how this will sort of impact globalization in the long run is still a bit of an open question, but it definitely does sort of risk this sort of balkanization approach where trust can be built between parties that more naturally share values and norms, and not so easily in areas where maybe those values and norms are not really the same. And if that sort of nearshoring and reshoring and nearshoring question is directly related to that, and is very active conversation, including in chips that Mike I think mentioned before, and they can be sort of seen as symptoms of this, or they can be seen as sort of partial, I think, solutions as well. But nonetheless they're good examples. So states are really sort of forced towards thinking about where should we have strategic or sovereign autonomy, what are the resources, what are the capabilities we need to have in the country, what are the sort of capabilities and resources we can trust to our friends, possibly close to us, and what are the sort of capabilities and resources we can have a bit more globally spread, but still between allies. And I think that kind of reflects to the first question as well in lots of ways, because Europe has woken up to the importance of having at least certain level of strategic autonomy. How trustworthy does that make Europe to other partners? How is that conversation again had in terms of what are the issues where you can openly share, where you have to do more exclusive sharing? So how do you determine that sort of risk and that threat level to determine whether you can share or not? It's going to be very difficult. And unfortunately, in this current context that we are in, where really, if other states have malign sort of intentions, it is clear that they can inflict a lot of damage. So there are areas where we can't take that risk, and it mainly is sort of being applied to disruptive or frontier technologies, whatever you want to call them, such as AI and quantum, biotech, and so forth. But one of the problems is that the context is also getting broader and broader. And if you look at, for instance, the concept of dual use technologies, you can already see that broadening there as well. So we can't nominate everything as critical that we have to protect and limit access to, and we can't have everything open. So again, I don't really have good answers in sort of definitive answers, but this is the conversation I think we really need to have very seriously. And also just lastly about those submarine or undersea critical infrastructures, I think it's something that we've forgotten somehow. And a lot of people think that internet is somewhere operating somewhere up there in the cyber sort of domain, but actually over 90% of our internet connections pass through those undersea cables. So I think this is another example where when we kind of establish that massive global network of critical infrastructures underseas, did we really consider the risks and the security well enough? Probably not.
Thank you, Christian. Maike, your take on these three questions?
Yes, well, I agree with much that Christian just said. I think a lot of this, a lot is already happening in dealing with the reshoring or friendshoring And it's happening for understandable reasons, right? Because we all have come to see the limitations of too much connectivity and the need for trusted connectivity. So I think that second that second question is already well answered. What makes the EU offers interesting to partners? Yeah, well, I guess it all depends on what you're talking about. But in general terms, I think you can look at this question in different ways, right? I think the fact that also those countries, then I think the big countries in Asia were mentioned, Japan and South Korea, Singapore. Why are we interesting for them? Because they are also looking for trusted partnerships, right? Those countries are also looking for stable supply chains, especially for critical products, and to build next generation technologies with countries that have the technological edge and also can be trusted. So that's also in the interest of those countries to be working with us in those fields. Separately, I think working with the EU is also a way of creating space in between, or in the context of this US-China rivalry. We are not the only ones that are uncomfortable with both China's approach or proposal, if you will, in terms of the model of digital authoritarianism, as some call it. That it is building at home and is also helping to build in some other countries. And we are also not the only ones who feel sometimes uncomfortable about, what is called a capitalist surveillance of the United States or American companies, I should say. So they are also looking for sort of a third way, and they don't have the power. I mean, the EU has the market power to force change, for example, on big companies, even on American big tech, right? Then they will fight it, and sometimes they will just pay the fine, thinking that it's peanuts anyway. If it's for that company, for a company of the GAFAM sides, paying a lot of money. What seems to be a lot of money is actually not so much money if you can still access the market. But the EU can do that. So other countries see that, and they want also to benefit, and perhaps want the EU to do more of that, so that they can be inspired by that regulation and also implement it in their own spaces. It's not without reason that the EU's GDPR has been an inspiration for countries from Japan to South Korea to India and Indonesia, other Asian countries, to build their own data protection legislation, right? That's a fact. So I think in that sense, also creating that space, creating partnerships. And then also, we don't have digital platform companies in Europe, right? Those are really from the United States and from China. We can be frank about it, and we have to sort of invest in that, making sure that sort of the next generation also comes from Europe. But we have a problem here. What we do have still is two infrastructure giants, right, from your part of Europe, Ericsson and Nokia, and they can also build critical infrastructure that countries want. And they would want it also perhaps more from your countries than from China, for the same reasons as we, many countries in Europe opted for their core networks to not go with Huawei. And they will not like to say it out loud, but this is a fact. Malaysia recently chose, I forgot if it's Nokia or Ericsson, that's really terrible. But they chose, European standards over Chinese standards recently when it came to their 5G network. So those are important things that we still can offer. Also on green tech, right? Think of the positive contributions that digital technologies can have for development. Green technologies are key. And we have a lot of that also. So we can help countries with that transition. And also, frankly, still as key investors, they're looking at us. That's at least what I hear from many countries. They're also looking at, okay, you have a quite developed single market, not full-fledged digital single market, but there's a lot of things we can learn. The single payment, European payment area, if they want to create a payment space, also digital payment space, between that can make for safe, transfers also between countries in Southeast Asia, without sort of the high fees that come with every transaction, that makes a huge difference for the many diaspora that are living, in one country and actually coming from another countries sending money to that to their family back home. And those are things that examples of where they want to learn from the EU. And this is going obviously beyond, the big countries that were mentioned again in the question. It's also, really targeting Southeast Asian countries and countries in South Asia. But I think, we shouldn't lose sight of their development.
Thank you for those answers. Maybe still one quick follow-up question, because of course there is the question of what can the EU offer Asian countries, but maybe it's also worthwhile to think about the way around what can Asian countries offer the EU. And I'm asking this question because I was thinking about Japan, because Mike, you mentioned the need to have a multi-stakeholder model to include the private sector in connectivity undertakings. And well, of course, Japan has been very good in doing that. They have always had a very close tie between the government, between development, and then the private sector. So could the EU learn from Japan to get the private sector more on board in these connectivity efforts?
Yes, and I think, that seems to be sort of happening already. The EU is now looking also at what we call the financial, more financial instruments for development. Here, yes, Japan is one interesting example for sure. I'm not sure that we want to build sort of huge bureaucracies that Japan has for that. We will probably be too competitive between EU member states to allow for that. And also averse of too much bureaucracy. But I think even that model, as a matter of principle, where the trade promotion and the development and the government agencies really do work way more closer together and bring scale to projects that is really required, is something that we can learn from. Also in digital connectivity, I mean, let's face it, in many ways, areas in the Indo-Pacific are far ahead of where we are, right? Digital payments is one. We have very strong traditional banking system. Everybody almost in my own country has a bank account. So digital payments and digital finance is way less developed here. And it's more developed in parts of Southeast Asia and in China, for example, where you could pay with your mobile phone. I don't know already how many years ago. And there may be aspects where we don't want to go. The super apps that have been created, where payments and chat services and digital identity may be brought all together in one super app. I don't think we want that for data privacy reasons. But in other ways, the systems that they have built, I think, is also what could be really, useful for us to develop from. And if we open our markets to that, we can, they can also have market opportunities here that they are looking for.
Thanks a lot. I think it's almost time now to close this webinar. I would like to thank you very much, Mike and Christian, for being willing to speak at this very first connectivity conversation. There are more to follow in the near future, and I'm sure you'll find out about them through the usual channels. Thank you very much, both of you, and also thank you for the audience for being with us today, and hopefully see you on a next occasion. The seminar is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.